happening where people can create a logo for some of the work you're creating today. Put it on Behance. We'll explain that a little bit more in a moment. Put it on Behance. We're going to grab it, and you'll choose between, if we get one or two or lots of entries, you'll choose and use it in the artwork you're creating today.
That's right.
But Jeremy, before we get started, could you tell us a little bit about your background? Where did you get started?
Yeah, sure thing. So first of all, it's great to be here. I'm super excited about this. Really looking forward to kind of sharing the process behind this illustration with everybody. My background is I'm actually half French. So I studied in Paris. Did about a 6-year course, very sort of classically trained. And I actually graduated with a master's in graphic design and started working sort of for various branding agencies. Little by little, started doing a lot more illustration for them. And then I thought, look, I really enjoy doing illustration. Obviously, everybody kind of was asking me to do illustration, so I'm happy to kind of take on that mantle. And I started doing sort of freelance illustration. And I've been doing that for about 15 years.
Wow.
Yeah, so predominantly working for branding and advertising agencies on sort of huge range of different products. Illustration is pretty sort of prevalent in a lot of fields. And then also kind of doing a lot of personal work, which the idea sort of behind is to inform the briefs that I will then get commercially. But a lot of the personal work that I do is online. I will sort of put it on prints, sell the prints, do shows, T-shirts, all this kind of stuff.
Okay, so you talked about some of the projects that you've done in the past. So specifically, the one I want to ask you about is the one you did for Xbox. How did that come about, and what was the project?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. Sorry, where through sort of a collaboration with Adobe, I started sort of working with Microsoft, and they lent me this computer here, which is the Surface Studio. And I thought, look, while I've got it and sort of testing it out, might be a good idea to actually do an illustration that they could potentially use and then pitch it to them, because I guess it is all about sort of having the right contacts and sort of getting your work in front of those people. So I did an illustration for Xbox. I'm a bit of a gamer. I'm a lot of a gamer, actually. And so I thought, look, this is something that I'm quite passionate about. And so I created this little mini brief, something that could actually sort of be a real world brief. Made the illustration, sent it over to them and said, here, look what I made. Do you guys want to use it? If so, good. If no, no harm done. And they said, yeah, we love it. Let's do something with it. So yeah, it's kind of a little bit of an unorthodox way to go about getting a job. But I think it's an interesting one because it is sort of this definition of do the work you want to be asked to do. Even if that means do it before you're asked to do it, just kind of just do the work and then find somebody to commission you for the work that you've already done in a sense. Yeah. Okay.
Do you actually have an example of the Xbox work?
I should do. Yeah, actually, so I'll pop it on a flash drive. Yeah.
If while we're talking about it, you go, oh yeah, here's the work I did and jump to that.
So it's the one that's behind us now on screen.
So they're seeing it anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. All good. Okay. So they can see it. Don't worry. So when you first started doing illustration during the course and after the course, did you work in analog or have you always worked in digital?
So I'm classically trained. So again, what that means is, sort of hours of doing casts and things in a sort of school with charcoal and pencil and sort of teachers going, this is not art, you're doing it all wrong. And so I've got a sort of a good base in sort of using those kind of analog materials and mediums. But started kind of using Photoshop and sort of figuring out the ins and outs of it, and kind of never looked back from there. What kind of the things that I really like about Photoshop is just the really sort of fast workflow that you can produce. You can produce a lot more work. There's a sense of kind of you can keep making changes, you can keep updating the work, which in some cases can also be a bad thing because it leads in certain cases of like never finishes the work. When is the work finished when it's digital? But yeah, it's just the pleasure of kind of working with something that works the way you want it to, and in a sense as well, I think a lot of people will use this program and use it in different ways. So it's kind of bending the program to do what you want it to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say probably 99% more digital than analog these days.
Right.
But I do keep a sketchbook, which I think we'll kind of talk a little bit about.
So do
later.
you ever work in analog and then transfer to digital?
I do,
and
yeah,
continue
sometimes.
working?
Yeah. Most of the time, I'll actually do a digital sketch
Mm-hmm.
and then work it up that way.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I do just kind of take the time to put pencil to paper and then scan that in and bring it in. The reality, however, is that when you're working commercially, pretty much everything that you're going to submit is going to be a digital file. And I mean, you're never going to be asked by a branding company to come in with your 2x4 meter canvas and hand that in as what's going to be used. So to make changes, to kind of work to the deadlines that are imposed by the industry, that generally means a digital workflow.
Cool. Okay. So can you talk a little bit about your style now? You've got a really very specific style now of the work that you've been doing in the last few years. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So style is a bit of I think, a prickly issue for a lot of people, and it's something that I talk about with my students quite a bit. So I teach at Billy Blue on the side as well. And it's this sort of thing of like, do you look for a style? If so, do you find someone else's? How does your kind of style evolve? Who are you? What do you do? Are you copying someone else's? There's all these kind of questions that come into play.
Sure.
And I think for me, for a long time, because I used to work with branding agencies, and sort of every brief in branding is kind of different, requires a different style, a different artist. I was a little bit of a sort of a chameleon of doing a whole bunch of different things, but nothing really sort of specialized in one field or another. And as much as I do enjoy kind of doing some vector work, some water paint, some watercolor, some paint, some digital, some pencil, again, somewhat through sort of constraints of the industry, it's good to have a sort of plant your flag somewhere and do a certain thing. So for me, that was just kind of looking at my childhood and my upbringing, sort of thinking, I used to skate. I was born in the 80s, big fan of the 80s, big 80s nerd. I grew up with a lot of Japanese manga, so I grew up in France. There was a huge sort of cultural exchange in the 80s and 90s between France and Japan. So we got a lot of mangas and anime that not necessarily any of the rest of the countries did.
Sure.
So I just thought, I'll dip into that and kind of put it all onto one page and kind of see what happens. And it's led to this kind of future 80s Japanese neon kind of thing going on, which was maybe not necessarily my intention as I went into it, but I'm very happy with what I'm doing at the moment, which isn't to say that it might not evolve, but at the moment I'm super happy doing sort of neon colors, 80s with a little bit of Japan thrown in there.
The world needs more neon. So,
Yes.
I'm without talking too much further, I'm going to get you started doing some work. Now, while Jeremy gets started, just wanted to invite any of you, if you've got any questions at all, if you've got any questions that you want to ask Jeremy, just put them in the chat pod. We'll get them through here and I'll pass them on to Jeremy and he'll be able to answer them as we're going. So Jeremy, what are you going to work on today?
Okay, so I'm going to work on something a little bit.
Can I just stop for a
special.
sec?
Yeah.
How are we going? Was that too long an intro?
Okay.
Bring it much shorter? Yeah, cool. So
Okay.
some of those questions I'll pass you while you're working.
Okay.
So I'll get you working quicker.
All right.
Yeah, okay,
well,
cool.
I might also kind of go into less detail about sort of all the answers that I go
And
into.
then, like, if we do an intro, cut to actual drawing, and then you can ask questions while
Yeah,
drawing.
totally. So
while
I might
I'm,
just
while
do
I'm
the...
drawing the piece, or while I'm just doing random drawings, do you think?
The piece.
So we might introduce the piece earlier and
Yeah.
some of the questions. So I'll ask you the one of where did you get started first as a chat to get people in the room. And then after that one, I'll get you started, invite people to comment, and then I'll start asking you about your style
Yep.
and stuff, etc.
Okay.
And the Xbox One, etc.
And that's where there's going to be different backgrounds where we can talk about some of the pieces, so that's where they come over. Because then there's obviously the interactive element, there's also the competitions in terms of, number one, sending in your Behance link, but also after the show, if you upload your own 80s design, your own 80s inspired character, you can win a signed print as well.
So what do they need to upload after?
So there's two competitions.
Yep.
There's a signed print, which you can upload anytime after the stream, and then there's the kind of create along, which is your own logo. Now, some of that stuff we can trigger ourselves, if that makes it easier for you, but it'd be good to talk about winning a signed print. So follow the chat.
So they're going to win one of Jeremy's signed
Yeah,
prints.
that's-
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool.
That one right there.
And what do they need to upload in order to win that?
So that is their own character, so they can design. Their
Okay,
own
so a Photoshop illustration.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Okay. And Jeremy's going to judge that?
Until Sunday.
Yeah.
And Jeremy will judge that?
No. Well, we can.
Not during the show, but after the show, Jeremy's going to be the judge? Yeah, okay, cool.
Okay, so we're not doing the thing where I'll pop it actually onto her T-shirt. doing
Yeah,
the
so
thing?
two.
That's
That's the
two
other
separate
one.
ones. So there's
Okay.
one where we're just taking the design, and that's kind of a value add during the show. They're just winning a creative prize.
Yeah.
So the second one, I'm going to ask you what you require for the logo. So it's a logo for a T-shirt.
Yeah.
I'll ask you to define that a little bit. What are you looking for?
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll ask people during the show if they want to create it,
Yeah.
upload it to Behance. Send us a link in the chat pod to the Behance file, and we'll have a quick look through, sort them, and you can choose from
So that's
those.
during the inking. So that's during the inking. So that's when we call out section. So that's when we call out section.
Yeah, but is that fairly early on because they're going to need a bit of time, obviously.
Relatively early.
Okay, cool. All right.
Okay.
Still coming on your laptop, right, Paul?
Yes. Stod is going to send me the Behance links,
Yes.
and I'm going to open them up. Once I've got 4 or 5 at some stage when you need to, or a few minutes before you need to use them, if you let me know, say, what have you got?
Yeah.
Have we got any Behance entries? I'm going to go, look, we've got none.
Okay.
People are slack. Or I've got a few here. Let's have a look. And then I'll have a look at these, and then I'll
So
pass
when I
Stod, Stod,
from the library, yeah.
yeah, Stod, did you get a link to Jeremy's library? So if you can put them into his library, I'm just going to show them here, but I'll need the link here so I can open them up and show people.
The links.
The link to the project that they upload.
You give the links to Paul, and then you can drag and drop the image.
Yeah.
And then I'll open those all up in tabs, depending on how many there are. Do we want Stod to be selective, or assuming we get 50?
Yeah, I mean, if we get 50, then we'll be selective. But if we get like 6, then we'll show.
Yeah, we'll show them. Okay, cool.
Do you think we should start with the top? If we make the intro like 2 minutes,
Into.
like really short intro.
Oh yeah, sure. So we'll shorten that. Okay, so we've now got Jeremy working. So tell us what are you going to create today?
So talking about sort of style and this kind of idea that we're sort of sorry, I might not go down that way. I'm going to work on something that's actually kind of a collaboration between myself and an amazing analog artist called Vanessa Vanderhaven. And the idea behind this is essentially stepping out of your comfort zone. How do you adapt your style to someone else's? How do you work together? And so I've actually met Vanessa at an event, at a design event, and immediately kind of clicked with her and sort of thought it could be super interesting to mix a very sort of classical design approach with a very digital workflow. And so we kind of looked through some of her reference points. She did this amazing portrait of Margaret Zhang. And then I thought, okay, cool, how do I adapt something that's still within my style to this? So what I'm going to kind of do today, is just go through my process behind this in a step-by-step, show you guys some tips and tricks on how to sort of work in Photoshop, or how I work with Photoshop and color. And also a little bit about kind of adapting my style. So Margaret Zhang being originally Chinese, obviously I've had to kind of adapt that. I usually work with Japanese themes, so how do I kind of work with that? How do I work with a sort of a main piece in the illustration, which is her face, which is not digital, which is analog? So how do I blend the two together, and how do we kind of work back and forth? So there was a lot of sort of collaboration.
A bit quicker. Okay. You can start maybe while you're working. You can start talking about it, but I think we need you to get pen on paper quicker.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
Okay.
So I guess the first step is just kind of taking in the pencil drawing.
So this piece of artwork Vanessa did on paper first?
Yes, so she works in pencil and paper, and she scanned it in, emailed it over to me, and then I'm just going to take this in Photoshop and work it up and just kind of add layers to it and see where we go with this.
Cool.
So the first step with this is always to kind of bring in the artwork. So I'm going to create a new document. A4 will do fine at this stage. and I will literally just kind of grab this and bring it into my file here. I can close that. I can resize this guy down to slightly more acceptable size for the piece. And then what I will need to do is, you can kind of see on screen that there's a little bit of kind of the actual paper showing up on there. You guys can see that there. So I'm just going to have to play with levels a little bit. And this is all part of just kind of working with an analog drawing. Sometimes you have a sketch, sometimes you have a finished piece like this. And just getting it up to a spot where the contrast is good and we've kind of gotten rid of the paper around it. So we've just got the actual drawing
Sure.
there. The next thing I'm going to do is super important, I think. A lot of people kind of ask me this question, a lot of my students ask me this question, is how do you work with a pencil drawing and sort of paint with that? So the gist of it is the layer has to go on top, and we're going to go into our blending modes here and just pop it on multiply. So it doesn't look like it's done anything at this stage, but if I put a layer underneath this and quickly kind of paint a little bit, you'll see that it's, let me give it some horrible Joker lips, the color, the drawing is staying there in front of that. So it's kind of like on tracing paper on top of it. So I'm not losing any of the drawing. And that's the premise of how I work. So I'm just going to name this as well. So naming your layers is a pretty important part of your workflow. So if you're starting to have sort of 50 layers and they're all called sort of layer 1, copy 5, starts to get a bit messy. So it's a good idea to name your layers. It's not something that I particularly enjoy doing, and to be honest, I don't always do. Sometimes I go back in and name my layers, but yeah. So what I'm going to kind of do now is I'm just going to start messing around with a basic sketch and a few different ideas. So the way that we're kind of going to work today is I'll take you guys through some sort of basic steps, and then we'll skip forward a little bit to kind of go through, like, this is it finished, right? So the idea here is, all right, so we're going to kind of make her a little bit, sort of empower her a little bit, put a pose in there that's going to be interesting. So at this stage, I'm going to keep it really loose. I'm going to switch to my main mode here. I'm going to use the dial, which I've set up to have a brush and eraser kind of tool. So that's going to be really handy for me at this kind of sketch stage. So I don't really need anything else here. I don't need all the mess of the windows. I'll just make sure that I am actually on a new layer, which I am, and then I'll just start sketching. So basic sketch is just going to be really loose, really kind of soft lines. I'm not worried too much about kind of detail at this stage, just getting the main kind of pose down and seeing where it kind of lands. So
Jeremy, when you're working on a piece, do you know where it's going before you start, or it's sort of it's the process and the trick that decides what it's going to be?
I've got an idea of what I'd kind of want it to be, but then I think for me, it's kind of good to let the piece kind of take on a life of its own, for sure, and see kind of where it goes, make changes, which is one of the things that kind of Photoshop really allows you to do quite well, is just make these changes. So it's important to have a little bit of a roadmap of where you kind of see this piece going, otherwise, where do you start? But it's also kind of a good idea not to get too kind of bogged down and think about, how this is going to work. So I'll do a lot of changes as I'm working, which is why we're going to kind of go through these steps and kind of skip a few, because essentially the piece that we're going to go through in sort of 40 minutes would generally kind of take me about sort of 10 hours.
Okay, so it's a typical project about a day, 2 days?
Yeah, something like that, yeah. And again, it's just down to kind of ideation and sort of what you're going to do. Can you kind of commit to something or not?
Sorry?
Can you turn your phone on vibrate or something so you can know when a message?
I'm getting messages here.
Yeah.
And you wanted to know whether he uses a sketchbook. I've already asked.
No. mean, that's like this is a question from the stream.
Oh, from the stream. Yeah.
Question.
Question from Cindy. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I asked that already, but I'm happy to ask it again and
Yeah.
pretend
I
that
just
Cindy's
wanna
online.
see how-
Cindy online from Sydney, Australia has asked Jeremy, do you use a sketchbook in your process at all?
Not necessarily in my actual process. So on something like this, obviously this is a fully digital piece, so I won't necessarily use a sketchbook. But in my general sort of life, I guess, I use a sketchbook all the time. So I carry a sketchbook with me everywhere I go. I'd love to say that I do a sketch every day. That's not necessarily the case, but I think it's important to keep a sketchbook to sort of be hands-on. It's a visual diary, essentially, is what it is. Anytime you kind of get an idea for something, you kind of jot it down for later, because otherwise you'll forget. So I think it's a really sort of valuable tool to have, a visual diary, just to keep your ideas fresh and keep you keen.
Cool. Great question, Cindy. And we've got a copy of Creative Cloud coming your way right now.
Okay, so at this stage, I think this is just going to be kind of me for the next however long it takes me to get it down right. There's a sense here of, obviously, it's going to be a little bit more detailed than this, but
So while you're doing this, some of those questions that I asked you before, I'll be asking you when you do this. So some of the process, the background, some of the projects and stuff that you've worked on. Yeah.
Cool.
So we'll do the shorter talk at the beginning, and I'll throw the questions at you while you're doing this.
As I'm drawing. Yep.
Cool.
Okay.
So you just keep sort of working while you're headed. Yeah.
So I think one of the important things at this stage is to not get too committed to anything. So you'll see me sometimes really work around and just go, you know what, that arm's not working, get rid of it, start again. And there's an expression in illustration and painting which is called murder your darlings. And it kind of refers to this idea that, you know, you've labored for sort of 20 minutes on something and you really like it, but it's just not working. It doesn't fit. It's too big. It's too small. It's out of proportion. Got to get rid of it.
Right.
Don't try and sort of change it and tweak it and blend it. It's just easier if you start again.
Sure.
And so you do have to be a little bit ruthless with that and kind of not be afraid to get rid of things, because this is going to be the basis of everything. And it's kind of like building a house. If you build it on foundations that aren't solid, it's all going to be wonky, and you're only going to realize later on when you've done even more work on it, and then you're just going to be even less willing to change it. So at this stage, I think this is just going to be me kind of tweaking, making changes, trying to get the pose right, trying to sort of move her hand around. I will also use some reference at times. So a lot of what I do, I tend to like to just try and freehand a little bit, but every now and then, particularly with hands, hands can be a bit of a nightmare. I'll need reference. And either I will use myself as reference, or I will use my girlfriend as reference as well. So when I it's an angle that I can't quite sort of take myself, I will use that reference. And so it is something that I think a lot of people would be reluctant to do or afraid of doing, and it's super important. If it's going to help you get it right, then use reference always.
Okay, cool.
Don't trace, obviously, but use your reference, get it down right, and sort of after a few hours, this is where the piece kind of ends up. So this is me kind of jumping ahead a few hours, and you can see that I've obviously used the hand from the first one here to kind of draw this one, and it's helped me massively. With this one, I've been sort of fortunate enough to be able to kind of draw without using that reference, which is something that it's just a bit of a test I give myself, just to like see how good I can be and kind of push my skills. It's not necessarily an ideal scenario, but there we have it. So that's the main kind of body pose, and I will always draw the main body as a sort of like naked, so to speak, just to get the proportions right, make sure everything's good before I start sort of dressing her up.
Right. I'm going to ask the question everyone's thinking, what's she holding?
She's holding a bow, which is a Chinese kind of fighting pole stick.
All right.
Yeah. Again, this is out of kind of my comfort zone. If I was doing something that I would normally do, I would go with sort of your traditional sort of samurai weapons and all those kind of things.
Okay, cool.
But I've had to do a little bit of research here and just kind of think about, you know, how is this going to work? What can she be holding? So on and so forth. So at this stage, I'm happy with everything. So I'm just going to make a new layer here and start thinking about ideas for what could she be wearing? And again, sort of keeping with the sort of the 80s themes, keeping with, again, maybe Chinese themes. I'll play with different things at this stage. But it's good for me to kind of think about using a different color. So let's say she's wearing a t-shirt. I'll just draw that using a different color and draw that on top of her. So it's literally just kind of pasting a t-shirt onto her, but because I've got the body shape down already, that's just going to make my life a whole lot easier
Simpler to do.
to dress her
So
up.
you've created a new layer for this. How many, typically in a project, how many layers do you end up with?
It really depends. It can be anywhere in between 10 and 70.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And we'll get to that. As the piece kind of progresses, you'll start to see kind of more and more layers happen. We're going to be working with adjustment layers as well to work with color and shading. And it's something that is, I think, one of the real strengths of Photoshop is this idea that you can just make as many layers as you want. After a while, though, it can start to hinder your process a little bit. If you've got like anywhere above 100 layers, I think it might start to get a little bit messy. But essentially, yeah, this is just going to be me thinking, all right, sort of, how do I make this a little bit 80s? How do I include a little bit of Chinese theme? So maybe she's got one of the sort of the kind of kimono looking things. Her sleeves are going to start to get a little bit longer. That sort of hints to the sort of Chinese ideas. Maybe her collar kind of comes up here and we give her the little kind of Chinese buttons. Mm-hmm. All these kind of ideas that I'll usually kind of put on a separate layer. You can add as many layers as you want and sort of try different things. In the end, I've ended up going for your 80s blazer. With the big lapels kind of thing, and giving her a little t-shirt just kind of tied into the middle. Make it a little bit cute, a little bit sexy, but definitely very 80s as well. And the sleeves need to be rolled up. Again, give her this kind of like, super rad 80s kind of look.
Yeah.
And again, I'll generally try and sort of do this without too much reference. These are all things that I've kind of tended to draw as well in the past. The more you draw something, it just kind of goes into your sort of mental image bank. Mm-hmm. And yeah, just kind of mess around, see where the piece can go, give her some bangles, maybe give her a scrunchie at the top here, just trying to sort of messing around, seeing how we go. Give her some really rad 80s sunnies that were kind of already in the original drawing. Yeah, and again, keeping it pretty loose. Don't be sort of afraid to go back and forth on this. Fix any mistakes that you've kind of identified. And then once you're happy with it, again, just going to skip forward here and just go to this one where the actual clothing is done. I'm happy with how it looks. I'm ready for the next stage now, which is going to be inking. And so inking at this stage is going to take me heaps of time, and it's something that I like to spend a little bit of time on. I like to kind of get it right. It's all about the process. Mm-hmm. And you'll see as you kind of work with this, any of you guys who are familiar with working with Illustrator and Photoshop, a lot of people kind of make this comment on my work of, wouldn't it be easier for you to work with Illustrator to do the kind of smooth, buttery lines that I kind of like to work with? And the short answer to that is yes, absolutely, you're 100% right. It would be far more effective for me to work in Illustrator. But there's something about the process of, it's not all about the destination, it's the journey as well. Mm-hmm. And the process of me getting those lines right and just working them up, erasing, going back and forth with all of this and getting that line right, it's something that I really like doing. And something that I like to spend a little bit of time on. So I'll go into my brush and turn smoothing up to generally about sort of 30%. So smoothing is a relatively new kind of Photoshop feature. And what it essentially does is it makes your brush line go from something like this, very kind of jagged, or if you got had too many coffees, your line can get a little bit all over the place. So smoothing allows you to kind of get really nice, soft, smooth, buttery lines, which is again absolutely what I like to do here. So the brush that I'm going to be using is the most basic round Photoshop hard brush. There's no kind of I don't tend to work with too many downloaded brushes at all.
Okay.
I like to get it right with
You
the
don't
sort of the
create your
basic
own
tool.
ever, no?
Not necessarily, no, because the lines that I work with, again, are just going to be these kind of soft, smooth lines, using the sort of the pressure sensitivity to get that sort of thin edge on it, and just kind of working that up. And if it means that I got to do a line sort of 7 or 8 times, then that's what it means. That's part of the process. So at this stage, I've got my sort of basic drawing, and I'm just going to go over these and start essentially just digital inking, and all good. Again, this may take me some time, but that's time that I will really sort of enjoy spending on this, and just making sure that it's right, getting the kind of the folds right, getting those ends right. So I might sort of switch back into an eraser here and just make that real sharp.
So your original lines that you were creating, the original sketches you were creating, you're not too worried about line thickness or anything like that. You're just getting shape.
Yeah, that's it.
Structure. Yeah.
It's
So
literally
now-
just a kind of an underlying drawing for me to then go over with a sort of nice, thicker black line and get a sense of kind of what I'm going to do before I do it. Because if I just jumped in and started inking this from the get-go, I'd probably be creating more work for myself than I really need to do.
Mm-hmm.
So having that kind of base sketch down there, it's messy. There's a lot of stuff that is kind of not going to be used, but it doesn't matter. That eventually I will just turn off, and it will just be this black line.
Sure.
But at this stage, again, it's all about this kind of the process for me, trying to get the right line. And sometimes, like I said, it means, starting again. No, that's not quite the right angle. I'm a bit of a sucker for curves as well. So trying to get those lines just to kind of line up, match up, be aligned. Whenever I'm doing anything that requires 2 lines, like if I'm doing a tube, for instance, and I have to do this is going to take me a long time because I got to get it right the first time, and it's like, oh no, it's getting too close. Start again.
So I notice you're very quick on the Command Z.
Yeah. So I like to keep a sort of a hand on the keyboard as I'm doing this, and generally, I won't be too far from the Z key because it's just you just keep undoing, which again it isn't very efficient, and working with sort of vector allows me to make that line and then edit it later on, but I just prefer working in Photoshop. It's much more akin to an analog process. It feels a lot more like I'm drawing or I'm painting, where Illustrator is amazing, is in shape building and sort of editing those shapes, but it's just a completely personal thing for me. Just I prefer working in Photoshop. And it's something that I think a lot of my students kind of bring up is, should I be working with this? Essentially, whatever works for you, whatever makes you happy is what you should be doing.
Right, cool.
And there's no right or wrong. Nobody can come along and say, you're wrong to do it this way. The work looks good, I'm happy with it, so therefore it's fine. I'll just keep doing that. So at this stage again, this will probably sort of be me for the next sort of few hours working this, getting all the lines right. I'll have to come in later on and sort of match up the lines here with the pencil drawing, which is probably one of the challenges of this. Trying to get that pencil very sort of textured, lots of different sort of tones in the pencil to match up with my solid, thick, one color black line might be a little bit of a challenge. But if I just sort of skip forward here and go to the next phase.
So just out of interest, while you're opening the next one, while you say this would take you a few hours or more to get all of those lines right, do you enjoy that process? Do you find it quite...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's it's a challenge, and sometimes I kind of look at it and just go, what am I doing? Why am I doing it this way? But in the end, it's all about that sort of the process.
Right.
And again, it's that thing of like, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey.
Sure.
A lot of cooking analogies as well kind of match up to that. Just the process of you making the dish is just as nice as you eating the dish. In some cases, it can be more enjoyable. So, it's something that I wouldn't say that I necessarily look forward to it, because I know that it's going to take me a lot of time. But it's that pleasure of getting the line right and doing it the hard way, I guess. It's just kind of, when it's all finished, you're like, yes, I've accomplished something.
Are there any parts during the process that you find frustrating that you really
I'd say probably the first bit, which is trying to get the
shapes
composition and the shapes right and the proportions right, especially with working with human figures. That can be very unforgiving. A lot of people know what the human body looks like. So if you're drawing a tree and the leaves are too big, nobody's going to notice. But if you're drawing a hand and a face and it's too big in proportion, everybody will see it. So that can be a little bit frustrating. But again, it's that pleasure of like, I got it right. It's good. So all right. So this is the finished inking. As you can see, there's a lot of kind of really smooth lines, thick black lines. And then I'll just get rid of my original sketch. And at this stage, I'm going to start working in color. So this is going to be one of the steps for me that's going to take the longest amount of time. And what I'll do is I'll set up a new group.
Sorry, just to jump in, but is this when I should be encouraging people to do the logo for her?
Oh, yes. Yeah, so at this stage, we'll probably sort of announce the...
We've been pinging it as well.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Some like little overlays that appear on the screen.
So I'll just say like, look, we're going to start working in color, but we'd love for something to go onto her t-shirt, which is what the competition is all about. So hopefully if you guys can kind of work in something along the sort of 80s guidelines, a bit of a t-shirt design that's kind of 80s themed, and then upload that to the chat. Then I'll pop that onto Behance. Sorry, I'll pop that onto her t-shirt towards the end of the piece.
Okay, cool. So if people design something, Illustrator, Photoshop, you don't mind where it comes
as
from?
long as it's a PNG.
So create a PNG file. If you upload it to Behance, to your Behance site, and then send us the link in the chat pod, we'll be grabbing those together, and Jeremy will choose between whatever we've got a little bit later to put on there.
That's right.
And whoever wins will win a year of Creative Cloud.
So
3 months.
3-month extension of their Creative Cloud.
Say again?
3-month extension of their Creative
Oh, 3 months extension. Okay, fair enough. All right. We'll win Creative Cloud extension on their license.
Which is in 12 months. Why don't we just do that?
I'm not going to say 3 months
This is
because...
also when you mentioned the keyboard shortcut, isn't it? The
Yes, I'm going to start talking about this,
Which don't just mention it, I'll just know when to trigger it.
Okay, so I don't need to say, like, pay attention, people. Okay, cool. All right.
Cool. Okay.
Okay, so what I'll do at this stage is, as you can see, I've got all my layers named here. I've got a little bit of a code that I use. I've got sort of OTL means outline, and I'll just literally just call this culs because I'm lazy and I don't want to type in colors, even though it's just 2 more letters. I'll pop all my layers in here. So again, what I'll do is I'll just start with a basic kind of, just call it blazer, because this is going to be the t-shirt, the color for her blazer. And because I've got these nice, thick, sort of black lines, I can actually use the Lasso Tool here. So this is just my Lasso Tool, the regular one, which will allow me to kind of draw a selection, right? So again, there's a bunch of different ways that I could do this, but what I will literally do is I will just kind of make a selection, and it doesn't matter if it's super rough inside because it's just going to be behind this thick black line, and it's just going to make my colors seem really smooth. So I'm going to have to work something here, which was one of the challenges of this collaboration piece is obviously I don't have those smooth black lines yet, but I'll worry about that later. And I'm just going to select a random color. I'm not too worried about sort of setting up a color palette at this stage. Some people like to sort of go, I'm going to work with blues or reds or yellows or whatever and set up a color palette before they start. I tend to just launch in for better or for worse. So I will fill this. I'll generally kind of use a lot of shortcuts here. So I've got a foreground color and I've got a background color. To fill with my foreground color, so I'll just switch that to like a hot pink or something so you guys can see. To fill with the pink, I'm just going to use Alt or Option, Backspace or Delete, depending on what kind of computer you're on. And then to fill with the background color is just Command or Control, Backspace or Delete. Right. So that's just going to be avoiding me having to go to the Edit menu, go to Fill, and then go through that whole process. It's about sort of an economy of time, and just speeding up your workflow, making it kind of those keyboard shortcuts to help you out, which is what they're there for. So again, just kind of going in very roughly, and making these selections to
while
fill
we're doing
these.
that, I might get Stod to type those in the chat pod. So the fill with the foreground was...
Fill with foreground is Option or Alt backspace, and fill with background is Control or Command backspace.
Cool. We'll just get Stod to put some bits up in the chat pod while you're doing it.
Yep. So again, I'm using the Lasso Tool here just because I find it a bit faster. I could use my paintbrush to do this, and sometimes when I come to smaller little details, or again when I'm already using the brush and I'm too kind of lazy to switch back to that tool,
Paint straight in.
I'll just paint straight in. And again, I don't have to be too careful with that. If you turn off the
it's a mess.
outline layer, you can see that it's not clean.
Yeah.
So again, that's one of the things that I really like about sort of working with these nice thick black outlines is I get this real sort of easy, almost kind of paint by numbers kind of thing. So I'll just switch back to that and literally just fill all these in one by one, taking my time to do it. And then once I'm
Do
done...
you ever just use the fill tool on areas? Like duplicate the lines layer and fill it all?
No, not necessarily. I'm a pretty sort of simple Photoshop beast, really. Like I don't necessarily use any sort of super whiz-bang things. Because my pieces tend to be straightforward and my process is relatively straightforward, it's literally
Quite
just
simple
kind of
and
draw
straight,
and then fill in between the
cool.
lines. So we've kind of colored up her blazer. There's a few things, that I'll need to clean up down here and just make sure that it's nice and clean. But for the sake of what we're kind of going to be doing now is this is going to be me essentially going, all right, yellow may or may not be working for me. So I'm going to go into Control U or Command U to bring up the hue saturation menu. And this is where I'll spend a lot of time. And this is one of the things that I really love about Photoshop over Illustrator. So Illustrator has a recolor menu, but Photoshop's is a little bit more kind of live and immediate than the Illustrator one. And this will literally allow me to kind of drag this slider around and stop whenever I'm happy with a color. And just go, all right, maybe it's sort of 80s, so maybe it should be kind of like a pinkish pastel kind of vibe. So just desaturate that a little bit, brighten it up. And again, this is, this process, it allows me to come up with colors that I might not think of just top of my mind.
Sure.
And color combinations that will really work out. So I'll probably then just go in and say, you know what, I'll just color in a t-shirt real quick. And again, just for the sake of this, I'll do it a little bit roughly. And again, just fill that with my basic color, Command U, Control U, and I might just zoom out just so I can kind of see what I'm doing. And then literally it's just a matter of me going, what looks good now? What's kind of going to work with the pink blazer? The blue's making me happy right now, so I'll just go with that. Again, I might sort of drop that back a little bit. So for you guys kind of designing stuff to go on a t-shirt, maybe think about what's going to work on blue. But I'll probably change that later on, so we'll kind of see how that works out. So again, that's just going to be kind of my process. Need to name this. For the next few kind of rounds, I'll just kind of go through, paint her skin, paint the pants, paint the bangles, or do all these things in this group. So having that in a group is going to be super important for me later on.
Okay.
So again, I'll just skip forward here and go to the next phase where I've spent sort of, 6 or 7 hours just kind of going back and forth with all my colors, and I've landed on something that I'm quite pleased about. So again, something that's going to be really interesting for me to do here is because I've got all of these in a group, and you can see I've got a few layers here. So I've got her weapon on one layer, the pants on another layer, skins on another layer, so on and so forth, is if I'm kind of a little bit bored of these colors, eventually what I can do is I can actually put what's called an adjustment layer on this group. And this is going to be something that we're going to kind of bring back when we talk about shading as well. So I'm going to click on this little kind of half circle down here while I'm on my layer group, and I'm going to go to, again, the hue saturation. So this is exactly the same panel that we were just looking at before. And it's going to allow me to apply these kind of different colors to the entire piece and go, is there a better way for me to kind of do this? What are some of the different color schemes that I can apply to this? Am I happy with it? Yes or no? So that's going to be a really sort of handy tool for me to work with as well. I can also just kind of apply that to separate layers if I want to, so I can then go back in and recolor them and just kind of come up with these color combinations that I wouldn't necessarily think of. So the one that I've ended up with is not necessarily super sort of quintessentially 80s, but considering the kind of the color that I wanted to do for her skin, which is probably the one color that I was super set on at this stage.
Yep.
I didn't necessarily want to work too much around a whole lot of pinks, a whole lot of blues or whatever to try and get that contrast up. And so I've ended up with these colors. So what I'm going to do at this stage, once I'm happy with all of this, is start adding in volume and shading and lighting. A big part of my work is kind of neon, so I like to get really sort of strong shading, strong lights going on. And because Vanessa's already kind of identified a light source with this, I've already got something that I need to work with. So the light's going to have to come from the right side here. And how I'm going to do that is I'm just going to create a new layer, and I'm going to call this neons, because this is where I'm going to put all my sort of super high, again, she's kind of sitting next to a neon sign kind of vibe, and just pop colors in underneath my outline again. So again, it's just going to be really clean, really smooth, and just kind of get that lighting going. So sometimes this might take me a while because, again, I've created a completely new piece, so it's going to be hard for me to get proper lighting reference for this. Like, unless I get somebody to wear this blazer, handle this pose, find a blue neon and light it up that way, I'm going to have to kind of use a little bit of common sense here and think about how the light would attach to all these kind of shapes, how it would work, where would it go. And this is like a super fun kind of process for me to do. Something that I really enjoy doing is this kind of trial and error of, how much light is too much, where are the shadows going to go, how is this all going to work? And you kind of start to get a feeling of, all right, we're getting a little bit of attitude here. We're getting into the 80s, starting to be a little bit neon.
So we're going to need to speed up a bit.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, on that, you keep going, but on that, is there any chance of having a clock somewhere, a countdown clock that we can see?
Not,
or should I just use my laptop clock?
We can send you one. I can send you one, yeah. I'll do that for...
Where should we be at this stage?
So I don't know how long we've gone so far.
So
I'm feeling we got a short.
We're just on lighting and volume at this stage.
Yeah, I don't know how long we've been going, so I might need to.
Did we start at 11?
Just while we're on,
okay.
If you just some signals below the desk. So if you just see me doing that, is speed up.
Yep.
Or just slow down a bit or spend more time on that. But it's probably more likely to be speed up a bit. So yeah.
Okay.
So probably the way to save time, if you need to save time, is maybe doing less of each of them, just to do a section before we're on to the next. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. So at this stage, I'm just going to add the shading. So I'm going to put up an adjustment layer here, and just drop the overall brightness of it. Okay. But as you can see, it's kind of done that to the background as well. So because I've got all my colors in a group, I'm just going to go onto that adjustment layer and click this little guy, which is only going to affect just the colors underneath it. And then I've got a layer mask on this, so I'm going to just fill that with black, and then use my brush with white activated to bring those shadows back in and kind of get them matching up to where the neon lights are going. This was another challenge for me to try and think about, like, normally what I would do is the shading should really go all the way through here, because that's where the kind of the neon lighting is going. But that presents a problem for me when I get up here, because I've got a very smooth kind of pencil shading. So how do I match the two up over here? What I ended up doing is actually just not bothering at all and just doing a very much more kind of sparse shading exercise. But what I will also do at this point is add a shadow behind her. And again, because I've got all my my colors on one layer group, I'm going to grab all of my work that I've done so far and copy it. So Command J, I'm going to copy all of that, and then I'm going to smash it all back together and merge them with Command E. So what I've literally done is I've got everything that I've done on one layer, and I'm going to move that over so you guys can see. And in fact, I haven't done that the right way. I need to remember that for when we're actually doing it. I need to grab all of that, duplicate it, and do this. So what I've gotten is all the artwork there. And then again, I'm going to use my hue saturation, drop that down to a basic color. Oh, this is not doing it for me today. I'll have to plan that a little bit more carefully when we're doing it. What I'm essentially doing is this. So I've got a shadow. Whoops, that's not the right one. There we go. I've got a layer here that I've duplicated with everything on it, which is going to act as a shadow. So that layer is on a dropped opacity, but it's basically everything down with one color, move it over, kind of make a drop shadow, and then drop the opacity down.
Nice.
Right? What you guys can see at this stage too is that I've brought in a circle behind her to just close her in a little bit, and I've kind of cropped out some of the work that I've done. So this again was a bit of a challenge from a collaboration perspective, where because what I had earlier, if I turn that layer off, starting to lose the drawing a little bit, and it's a collaboration, so we want to see kind of Vanessa's really awesome work.
Focus on it, yeah.
So just crop that in with a layer mask on that group, just to make that artwork a little bit smaller, and just bring the focus back on her work as well. And again, that's all sort of part and parcel of a collaboration.
So while you're at this stage, I wonder if now's a useful time. We've actually got a couple of entries where people have put up some artwork onto Behance. So I'm just going to, if we just jump across to my machine, we've got this absolutely awesome illustration from, who was this? Cindy Chen from Sydney.
Yeah, that's great.
Cindy again, who was talking to you before. Yeah. And also from one of my favourite artists, up here we've got this absolutely beautiful neon 80s vector icon as well. So I'm going to send those across to you, and you can choose which ones to use in a moment. Okay.
So look, at this stage the piece is almost finished, and what I'll do at this stage is I start sort of adding details and sort of playing around with different ideas of what can happen more here. And it's at the same time as it's something that Photoshop is really amazing for, is like add more stuff. It's also something that you need to sort of treat quite responsibly. Of maybe the piece is finished, maybe it's done, but because I've got time and because it's a personal piece, I actually went into Illustrator to build these different shapes that I can then maybe use in the background. So I've kind of built this in Illustrator, and I'm going to drag it in just to sort of put as a shape behind her. And see how it looks, and sort of play around with colors. Maybe it'll be too much, maybe it'll be really cool. At this stage, again, just sort of messing around with this, and it can be fun. Obviously, on a personal brief, you can do that. On a commercial brief, maybe you got a deadline.
So on that question, while you're doing this, on that question, how do you find working with clients and clients' requests on a particular project as opposed to your own personal work?
So I think there's obviously clients are an important part of a freelance business. They're an integral part of a freelance business. You don't have a business, you don't have clients. It really just depends on the brief and the application of what I'm trying to do and what the client's requested. So certain times it'll feel a little bit like, again, a bit of a cooking analogy. It'll feel like you're trying to tell people that you do salads, and they'll walk into your restaurant and order a pizza, and it's like, it's not what I do. I can make one for you, and oftentimes you will end up doing it, but it's not necessarily something that I would seek out and advertise
sure,
as what
sure.
you're doing. So sometimes in
So
those
normally
briefs, it can be a
clients
bit
are coming to
frustrating.
you because of your style.
That's the ideal scenario, yeah.
Mhm.
That doesn't always happen that way.
Mhm.
Sometimes people just look at you and go, "You're an illustrator. We need an illustration,"
Right, okay, yeah.
which is fair enough, I suppose. And in those instances, it just means that you kind of just need to, how much do you want that job? Is it something that's going to be interesting? Is it working with a client that you want to work with again, or an agency that you want to work with again? And so there comes a point where maybe it's just kind of just do this for the next one kind of thing. But
Right.
again, that's something that nobody can really sort of dictate to you. It's sort of an intensely personal call that you need to make.
Mhm.
But one of the realities, as with this collaboration, you're gonna have to bend your wishes to someone else's overriding
Mhm.
brief.
Okay.
And sometimes it takes a little bit of diplomacy. Other times it's a little bit more straightforward. So I've had a little bit of both. I've had jobs where I've just been, yeah, absolutely, this is amazing. This is completely, I would kind of do this for free, even though I'm not going to do it for free. And other times where I thought, look, I'm not going to enjoy working on this,
Yeah.
but it's a freelance job, so I need it.
Sure.
And yeah, it's all about sort of taking on that feedback. So, yeah, at this stage, I think I'll start sort of putting in a few more details. So we've got a few submissions here. I'll just grab this one. This one's pretty cool, and bring it in onto her T-shirt. What's going on here? There we go. All right. Whoops. Need to bring that up here. And actually, I'll pop it into this layer. And we're just going to resize this, put it on her T-shirt. I might just kind of tweak it a little bit just to kind of make it look a little bit more like it's actually sitting on her T-shirt. And then resize it so I'm not cutting it off a little bit too much from that blazer. And just place it in there.
Hey Jeremy, you don't have the updated pictures in your library?
Nope.
Because they're in your folder. Livestream com.
Is there a refresh button?
I've got them in mine. So why is
Starting to run.
that?
Well, we can always claw it back in terms of.
You still connected to the net?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So wonder why you're not getting.
Maybe I need to quit and reopen.
I don't want to
should-
cross over the wrap up.
Mm.
Wrap up needs to be rehearsed.
You shouldn't have needed to quit. It should just appear. Mine just appeared in mine.
Yeah, they normally do. No. Mine.
Live stream code. Yeah, that should be the one. Just do. Is there a refresh?
The web view of it.
No, it should just refresh automatically.
Can you go to your libraries on the website?
The assets
On the
to
web.
.adobe.com.
Assets number 2, .adobe.com.
So what is it? Assets?
Yeah, assets. Then
Oh, you could have just clicked it in the. You can click it in your library.
That is
Um,
.adobe.com.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
View
Have they uploaded here?
Yes.
view on website.
Okay, so
Yeah, they've gone into there.
Okay.
That's interesting. Just click the cloud button and see if it's. Oh, here we go. Now it's updating. Yeah,
Ah,
there
cool.
we go.
All right, got 'em.
Okay, all good. Got them.
Yep.
Oh, what was it?
I just needed to
Had to hit the cloud.
refresh it.
Got to shake the cloud, make them come down.
Cool. So we'll grab this one, pop it in, and then I think that's it.
So once you've put it on the T-shirt,
Yeah.
Okay, so we need to work out how to sort of roll up the end of it. So you've put it on the shirt, and then show I think finish off with the finished piece large. Maybe talk a little bit more about the mesh tool in there. You just said, I'm just going to warp it. You didn't say what you were doing.
Sure.
So a little bit more about using the mesh tool just to warp the work in. Yeah. Finish off the piece. Do you want to hide the other layers and just have just the finished art on there? Yeah. Yeah, nice. Cool. Okay. So to finish off now, what logistics do we need to follow to finish off, assuming that we're pretty much like 2 or 3 minutes to go,
So,
ideally?
Well, we've got to the final bit, and we've got the bit about general tips, which is something that
Oh, okay, yeah. So,
so that's something that we can, it feels like we've been running over a bit, so that's something we can lose. So basically the wrap up, the final 5 to 10 minutes is a recap of what the main competition is, to send it to create your own 80s inspired character. So the kind of interactive during the show is submit a logo. After the show is create your own character.
and what are the art direction on the character? What should it be?
It's kind of 80s inspired.
Like this one. Can we make sure that they add
In the Jeremy Lord
Yeah,
80s
That's right,
Japanese
so it's basically
style?
creating your own 80s
Neon.
character.
when
Neon
they upload it to Behance, they have to use the hashtag
Adobe.
APAC Live.
Adobe.
APAC Live. Yeah.
That's the name of the stream. So if they put as a hashtag with their artwork, we'll be able to find it. And
Oh, okay. We'll search for it. Or they.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Because
Cool.
this is after
And
the stream.
in the next few days, Jeremy will decide on a winner, and they will
Yep.
win absolutely awesome signed print by Jeremy Lord. So, last couple of questions in case we have time at the end, and a couple that I might throw in to you as well. If you had one piece of advice for beginning illustrators, what would it be?
I'd say,
That's a hard one.
yeah, that's a hard one. Did we
Or any.
Did we
any-
go over
any
this?
tips.
Yeah, so this is
I can't remember what I
where
said.
you talk about keep practicing
Yeah.
sketching and illustrating outside
Yeah.
of it, because as we discussed, like electric, very acoustic guitar.
Yeah, cool. All right.
And that's
So
where some of that will appear on that as well. There's some sketches as overlays.
yeah, I'd say I'd probably, this is going to sound a little bit harsh, but just practice. Drawing and illustration, I think, is a very demanding mistress to have. And it's not like riding a bike where you learn how to do it and then you just don't do it for 10 years and you're right back in the saddle. If you stop doing it, you'll start losing some of those skills.
Okay.
And so keeping a sketchbook, drawing all the time, I think that's really the kind of the best advice there is out there. And sort of flipping back to the Xbox piece as well, just do the work you want to be asked to do.
Sure.
If you want to do some comic book illustration, don't do sort of watercolors and things like that, because you won't then be asked to do that kind of stuff. So yeah, keep drawing, practice, and practice smartly, I suppose. Yeah.
Top feature in Photoshop you like? Use the most?
Probably the brush smoothing, and actually I'd probably say the hue saturation menu. It's the one that I use the most. It's just I love it, and I spend a lot of time doing it, using it to different things. So probably that. Yeah.
Feature you hate the most?
Not being able to apply the same thing to separate layers at the same time. So making a selection across a bunch of layers and changing that color in that selection across a few
all of
layers.
them?
Yeah.
We'll work on that for you.
That'd be great.
All right, folks, could you please help me in the chat pod? Thank Jeremy Lord for coming along today and sharing.
Next live stream is in May. Just don't say when, but it will be in May.
The next live one is in May. Okay, cool. So please, in the chat pod, show your appreciation for Jeremy, who came to join us today. Absolutely awesome work, Jeremy.
Thanks
you
for having me.
very much for coming along. It's been absolutely
And
awesome.
Thanks to everybody who logged in as well.
And don't forget, the next live stream will be sometime in May. So join us again then. Jeremy, thanks very much.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.